Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duelist video. Today what we thought we'd do is predict where we think the meta is headed with the release of Asana and the new mini box coming alongside her, Heavy Strike Excavator. So with this new box we will be seeing 4 new decks come into the game. Buster Blader, we'll be seeing the Vast Vulcan deck, we'll be seeing plants, and we'll be seeing worms. Now there might be a few different ways to build these decks, but we're just going to talk about them kind of in a general kind of way. But first things first, we did just have a new ban list and some skill modifications. So this is the old list that we had that we thought represented the meta pre-World Championship qualifier. So first things first, Cyberse has really proven itself to be a much stronger deck than we had first thought, as well as the fact that Noodles has just been completely destroyed with a limit 3 on extra spice, as well as the skill getting nerfed into the ground. So that is probably going to go all the way down to High Rogue, which is going to feel kind of bad. Now, if we go take a look at our spreadsheet, we can see this is all the previous meta, but this still should give a good example of where we think things are probably standing right now. As we can see in all of the most recent tournaments, Cyberse has actually been outperforming. Machine is still doing well, and as we can see, is still the biggest slice on both of these pie charts, as well as still has the most wins overall, the most tops, that includes top 4 and top 8. So there's something to be said for that. So I think it goes without saying that Machine and Cyberse are definitely still the decks to beat. Now we have had one tournament since the new limit restrictions and the skill change. And during that event, we did still see Machine and Cyberse doing quite well, but one more deck did start to rise to meet them, and that deck is the Royal Rebels, which, as we can see, has not really been doing much at all in the last format. But the reason for that is that Royal Rebels has a really bad matchup into the Noodle deck. So with Noodles now basically dead, that does mean that Royal Rebels really gets to step up and show just how strong it is. So I think Royal Rebels possibly could now be going up to a tier 1 deck. Now, Royal Rebels isn't necessarily a tier 1 deck right now, but I think as people start to play this deck a bit more, they'll start to realize that this deck is actually pretty good into a lot of the other stronger decks. I think it has a really strong matchup into Cyberse, has an okay matchup into the Light Machine deck, but the Machines can also just use those big Mirror Innovator piercing attacks to get a lot of damage in against the Rebels before they can correctly set up, because the Royal Rebels do tend to have very low defense points. Another deck that seems to have really improved with the changes is the Magnum Overlord. So Magnum Overlord didn't get any buffs, at least not directly. What did happen though is that because both the Machine deck and the Cyberse deck now have limit 2s, they are now dissuaded from using Negate Attack. Negate Attack is the best way for any deck to survive a Magnum Overlord OTK turn. So with that tool gone, that now means that Magnum Overlord is a lot stronger into exactly these 2 decks. The other thing is that Magnum Overlord had a horrid matchup into the Noodle deck. So as Noodles fall, both the Royal Rebels and Magnum do rise. Realistically, Royal Rebels and Magnum should never ever beat Trap Noodles. Unless the Trap Noodle player got very unlucky and didn't see any of their traps to stop these decks, it should basically almost have a 100% win rate into both of these decks. And with the fall of Noodles, all of the decks that lost to Noodles are suddenly seeing a lot more play and do seem a lot more powerful. As for the rest of these, I think these are fine where they are. Maybe like Psychic could come off of Rogue at this point. No one's really playing this deck right now. And it doesn't really have any good matchups into any of the decks above it realistically, even though the deck is still kind of fine. I do think the rest of this is probably fine. Aggro is still a very strong deck. It's been around for so long, people don't really like it that much. It still is getting results, so we'll leave that on there for now. Blue Eyes, again, is still an okay deck, but does have a few bricking issues, which is why it's all down here. And its way to beat set 3 passes is a little bit wonky as well. Harpies are still fine. SAR maybe should drop down into High Rogue, but I think this is arguably still bottom of tier 3. But that now brings us to our new decks, and the first deck I want to actually add into High Rogue is the Ice Sark deck. Now, a bunch of players over in Japan have been playing this deck for a long time and have been kind of swearing that it's okay. I personally don't think the Ice Sark deck is that great, but it does have some very strong matchups, but it also has some really bad matchups. Ice Sark, I don't actually think has a way to really beat a Royal Rebel player outside of just getting very lucky, and that the Royal Rebel player just doesn't find the tools they need to actually just kill the Ice Sark player. But Ice Sark is able to summon quite a big board relatively easily. And they did also just get a buff in the sense that their semi-ruler has come off of limit 3, which means they can now play their back row hate in avian spell tactics. I think this stays at the bottom of High Rogue. I still don't think this deck is particularly good, but it's okay, and it did recently get a top 8 in an event. Next up is going to be the Buster Blader. So this is a deck that I actually predicted could be a tier 1 meta threat, but we didn't get the legendary Swordsman Buster Blader, which would have really pushed this deck into being a really powerful deck. Because of that, it's basically going to feel like Gaia the Fierce Knight control that just so happens to have the Buster Blader, and if Buster Blader is online all the time, the deck's going to feel pretty good. If it's not, the deck's going to feel extremely weak. So my first impression is that this skill isn't going to be super good. I think there will be some situations where the deck can just pop off, but I think you could say about any deck in Rush. If any deck in Rush gets the ideal hand, then they can feel very, very powerful. I think overall, the Buster Blader deck is going to feel a little bit underwhelming most of the time. Next up is Vast Vulcan, and I think this is probably going to go to the bottom of High Rogue. I really would like this deck to do something. The issue is this deck is realistically only going to be kind of a burn type strategy, but it's not going to be like a control-y style burn like the Noodle deck. This is going to be more of a just kind of throw all your burn tools at your opponent as quickly as possible, hope that they die before you do, and then call it a W. The skill that goes along with this deck I don't think is particularly good. The amount of burn you're able to get out of this card I also don't think is going to be particularly good, so I'm not really having any high expectations for this, but there is maybe something there. So I don't want to put any like lower than High Rogue, but I think it's going to be a struggle to make this deck feel good. And then next up we have the Plants, and I think Plants are going to again be a tier 3 deck. Plants does look like a reasonably interesting deck. We do have quite a few tools to gain that attack boost, we can gain that piercing, we have multiple ways to change defense position monsters to attack position so we can attack over them, but the deck doesn't feel like it's doing anything unfair. It feels a lot like Thunder when that deck first released, where the deck was clearly okay, but it didn't feel like it was doing anything unfair like a lot of the better decks were doing, and that's kind of how Plant feel right now. I think Plant has probably the highest potential to surprise everyone and just be a really, really strong deck and maybe make it to tier 2. But I really think it's not going to have that great a matchup into a lot of the decks above it. So I don't even think I'd want to put it above Blue Eyes. But I think this does have potential. And I think out of all the decks we're going to talk about, this is the one that could potentially go up into tier 2 if players find just the right build. And then we have the Worms. And Worms is a difficult one for me. I still think this is going to be another tier 3 deck. But I don't know if I think it's going to perform better or worse than the Plants. So Worms have a couple of issues. Their first one being that without their field spell, the deck basically doesn't do anything, and it does feel rather lackluster. The next is that we don't have barely any of their effect monsters, which means we don't have any of their interesting tools, nor do we have any of their spell and trap cards. So they're very far behind. And in the same way, Plants have a similar issue where they don't really have a lot of their spell and trap cards that would make the deck feel complete and cohesive. So because of that, the Worm deck is basically going to be 2900 attack turbo and kind of hope that that's enough to win. Now the maximum is still pretty good, right? You can easily get that thing up to like 5000 attack. If we get 10 or less cards in our deck with this skill, we can give it piercing, which can be pretty good. And I think that is going to be the primary way that we try and win games with this. But getting ourselves to having less than 10 cards in deck can be a bit of a struggle, as well as the fact the maximum does just lose to Tribute to the Doomed, like all maximums. So it's awkward. I think this deck is more Unga Bunga and might just be able to bully other decks. This deck is going to require a bit more finesse, a little bit more strategy, but could do a lot more because it has a lot more tools to actually get stuff done. So this is the list. I think this is where I predict things are going to land. And I think the most disappointing thing here is that none of the new decks have I put above tier 3. And I think that is the primary thing that's disappointing about the new box in general, is no one is really expecting any of these decks to actually be good. People are looking forward to getting their hands on these cards, we're looking forward to building and cooking with them, we're looking forward to playing with these cards, but I don't think anyone thinks they're going to overthrow the machines. I don't think anyone thinks they're going to overthrow Cyburst. I think most of these decks also do not have a good way to play around Doom Metal, so Royal Rebels will also be able to just wipe these boards and get in for massive, massive damage. But I think this is a good starting point for these archetypes. I think if we get more support for them going forward, Worms just need some of their spell and traps and some of their effect monsters. If we get the trap cards for the Plants, then they could obviously start performing quite well. If we get Legendary Swordsman Buster Blader, then the Buster Blader deck could also be very, very powerful. I'm not really sure if there's anything we can do with Vast Vulcan. It's traditionally been one of the weakest maximums in the game, but with 2000 less life points, any kind of burn strategy does seem a lot stronger. But that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.